talking about the political parties, and with less than a year to go until the 2019 general elections, questions being asked all over the place about the state of the three biggest political parties, that being the ANC, the DA and the EFF. And people want to know whether these three big parties are equal to the task of finding solutions to the challenges facing the country at the moment. So to help us elucidate this matter further, we're joined now by political analyst and author of the book, Could I Vote DA, Eusebius McKaiser. Thanks for coming through.
Thank you, Sakina, you rascal.
Well, you know, I know you're not here to talk about Steinhoff, but do you believe Marcus Jooste?
I absolutely don't, and I think today was critically important because what it reminded us, which does relate to the ANC that we're first going to talk about, is of course that when it comes to state capture and corruption in the country, it takes two to tango. For every corrupt person within the state, you need some person within the private sector or a company to be able to do all sorts of unethical and unlawful stuff. And I think one of the questions we need to interrogate after today's hearing, Sakina, is also the capacity of Parliament to provide technical oversight when you have some of these crooks who appear before a parliamentary oversight mechanism or body who really are technical experts at how they go about their business, and sometimes it's extremely hard for our MPs to be sufficiently empowered to ask the right questions. In many ways, I sometimes wish that some of our forensic financial journalists, the Craig McCoons, could be right there to whisper into the ears of the MPs as they are asking the right questions.
Well, let's start here. How would you characterize the state of the three big political parties right now? We're less than a year to the general election. What do you have to say for each of those?
The three main parties are the ANC, the DA and the EFF. All three our main parties are a hot mess. They've got massive problems to deal internally amongst themselves, leadership battles, ideological battles. Who are they? Key signature policies in terms of land, inequality, the economy that they haven't really figured out. And as I said to you earlier today when you and I were speaking off air in preparation for this conversation in part, Sakina, it's interesting, the EFF's problems are a gift to the DA and the ANC. The DA's problems are a gift to the EFF and the ANC, and all the fissures within the ANC currently are a gift to the other two. And I think it's impossible to predict how these weaknesses in each one of them, which we can unpack, will actually play out from an electoral outcomes point of view.
So why do you think they haven't been able to capitalize on the weaknesses shown by the other?
Let's take them one at a time. The DA cannot decide whether or not it is a classic liberal party in the mold of those who have come before, your Tony Leons, for example, or whether it is a social democratic party that really understands the fact that we are a country with deep inequalities based on apartheid, based on racialized categories going back all the way to colonial times. Because if they had to reckon with the history that you and I are passionate about, then they will have to accept the limitations of liberalism. So you have this bun fight inside the party between the likes of John Steenhuisen on the one hand, and then sort of younger, particularly black people like Mbali Ntuli, Makushule Ghana on the other hand. And when you do not have a cohesive identity, you can't come to the SABC and say to the nation, this is who we are, because you haven't resolved that question. The second challenge for them is a more pragmatic problem. They don't know how to handle coalition government. No one is going to get an outright win next year. And I think the DA suffers from an arrogance problem. They think, if I get 40% of the vote and Sakina gets 2%, but I need Sakina to help me to run PE or Tswane, then she must listen because I got the most. And they don't understand that the morning after the maths has already been crunched by the IEC, we are now equal partners around the table. And I think what we've seen play out in the coalition politics is a DA that is unable to reckon with what it means to have junior partners that have incredible power because they are kingmakers. And there are similar kinds of problems in the other two parties, but when you put it all next to each other, you've got three of the main parties who don't know how to deal with these internal issues, and consequently, us as the voters have horrible choices. It's quite frankly a voter's dilemma.
The EFF, because if the ANC is fumbling and the DAA is self-destructing, what is the EFF doing?
The EFF's fundamental problem, in my opinion, I'm not sure whether you will agree with me, is that in many ways they were birthed out of the discontent with Jacob Zuma. It is not clear to me that they were anti-ANC. as much as they were anti the Jacob Zuma ANC. And then Nasrec happens, and then we have Ramaphosa for a little while. We can talk about that in a moment. And now they have to recalibrate their strategy and tactics. So what do? You and I come back from the Christmas holidays, and the first thing we see as political animals and as journalists is that there's the EFF and they're busy fighting mannequins. Because when JZ is gone, what are you to do? They go to Woolies, they go all sorts of the places. So they need to understand that they must not panic. It's going to take a long while for President Cyril Ramaphosa and Luthuli House, the morning after Nasrec, to deal with what it means to win back the state capture. The fact that Zuma is no longer in the political scene doesn't mean that the EFF must panic, but they have been panicking. And they've been panicking needlessly because they are scared that with Zuma not being in the picture, that you and I as voters will suddenly give the ANC a second chance. I think they're wrong, by the way. But they genuinely believe that, and consequently we find them quite incoherent in terms of their tactics and strategy at the moment because they don't know how to handle the absence of Zuma.
So there is this toenadering between the ANC and the EFF. But the ANC, for their part, you know, you spoke about Nasrec and what happened there. And again, you know, these two are fumbling here. The EFF has their own problems, you know, leadership-wise as well. We saw what happened over the weekend. And the ANC keeps stumbling from one disaster to the next, it would seem, not being able to capitalize even on what's going on with their main opposition.
The ANC fundamentally have got two problems. The first is that the shadow state that had been put in place during the Jacob Zuma years, the remnants of the shadow state will be with us for many years to come. And so our state institutions are hollowed out. The criminal justice system has been captured. We have key parts of the state apparatus that had been captured. Jacques Poe tells us that story. How to Steal a City by Crispy and Oliver Olfer tells us that story in detail. Our amazing investigative journalists. So the first problem for them is, what story do we have to tell the electorate going into 2019? And it's not a good story to tell. The economic indices look horrible, and the reason is that it's going to take more than 6 months, 9 months to be able to undo the legacy of Jacob Zuma. That's their first problem. Their second problem is that we all keep forgetting that Cyril Ramaphosa did not win by a landslide in Nasrec. So he won the leadership battle, but he didn't win a mandate and agreement on key policy. And so there is also, as with the DA, by the way, there's also this inability of the ANC to be crystal clear, for example, where it stands on the question of land reform. And you can see how it is panicking in turn that maybe the EFF's left-wing rhetoric will really be rhetoric that you and I buy into. And suddenly, despite being a small third party, the EFF is actually setting our legislative agenda. And the reason they're doing that is that the factions in the ANC continue, even though Ramaphosa is the image of coherence and an image of the party actually being cohesive. They're not cohesive. He won the election, but he doesn't have a cohesive identity and set of key policies to take to the electorate.
And you're absolutely right. I had a look at their 2016 manifestos, all three of them, and you're right. It seems that the EFF is leading the way with regard to setting the agenda, because although they're the smallest of the three, they seem to be ticking off a few more against their manifesto than the others. But then, you know, let's talk about Cyril and Julius. What's that relationship based on?
You know, it's absolutely fascinating. I think there is some positive here that we must give some of our politicians. It's not they are all horribly bad at being politicians. I think President Cyril Ramaphosa has been pretty good at a tone level alone at neutralizing some of the militancy in the praxis and in the culture of the EFF. If you look, for example, at his very soft touch when he's engaging Juju in Parliament. And I think there it's been very hard for the EFF to be able to paint a picture of Cyril as a bogeyman in the same way in which they could with JZ. So I think there Cyril doesn't have much sleepless nights. His real problems are internal to the ANC. Fundamentally, you have to deal with the Northwest. You have to deal with your state institutions that have been captured, where it's going to take you 2 generations before you can rebuild the state. You have a bureaucracy that is not fit for purpose, Sakina. And with all of those kinds of problems, and then we told yesterday that we're now in a technical recession, we have formal unemployment.
It's a recession.
It is a recession, full stop.
Full
we can
stop.
drop the technical
Yes.
bit. Then you've got unemployment, even on the narrow definition, on the increase. I think his biggest headache is not the EFF. His biggest headache is, what is he going to tell you and me when it comes to the south of of Joburg to come and canvass for your votes.
But what does this mean for the electorate? If you have the three biggest parties and you know, the previous election results show us that people are moving away from voting for the smaller parties. So what does this mean for the voter out there when it comes to choices to make going into next year's election?
Sakina, it means not in prana for you and me, because it is a genuine dilemma. Either we're going to have to say to ourselves as voters, maybe we should revisit our faith that we have in multi-party democracy and take a chance on smaller parties. Like we used to think, I could vote for the ID because Auntie Pat is a good individual MP. I know that the ID doesn't have a mandate that is fantastic, but I want her to be in Parliament. Of course, not having a constituency-based electoral system makes it very hard for us to reason like that, because we do vote for parties, not for individuals. But the short answer is, and you can see I'm skirting around your question, that it's bad news for you and me. It will be interesting to see what happened to voter turnout and participation next year, because traditionally we love voting. Even our local election turnout is higher than the national election turnout in European countries in the global north. But I think the short answer is, to quote a subtitle by someone called Eusebius, a voter's dilemma.
And then obviously also, you know, again, just looking at the promises that these political parties have made in lead up to previous elections, they all seem to coalesce around corruption as the bogeyman. But you know, this is as political elites, as it were, because one could argue that it is actually inequality that is the big bogeyman here. Because when it comes to corruption, you can go to each of those parties and you'll be able to flash out quite a few people that they have not held accountable on their own. So what's your comment on that?
I hope that they're listening to this discussion between you and me. I think that the DA, for example, doesn't know how to deal with inequality, because you know as well as I know that it's an awkward conversation. It's easier to talk about poverty, corruption, economic growth being low. The problem with inequality in particular is that we will have to deal with things like white privilege. We will have to deal with things such as institutional racism in corporate South Africa, and the DA is not very good on those kind of conversations. The ANC in turn is also bad on inequality, because they will have to reckon with the fact that since 1994 we've had missed opportunities to deal both with income inequality and also with asset inequality. But I think you've nailed it. And I think if I had advice for them, pithy advice, yes, there are 1,000,001 problems that Sakina and I as voters want you to deal with, but really we're also simpletons, we're just human beings. Take one key issue, deal with it decisively, and take that story to the electorate. And if I had to pick one issue, and I know we want to have our cake and eat it, but if I had a magic wand, and as a politician I could only come up with a solution for one problem, and I had to choose between economic growth, unemployment, poverty, and inequality, I think inequality is the most important, and the reason is simple. It is the one out of the 4 different ills that correlate the most with social discontent in a democracy. It correlates more clearly even with gratuitous violence, more so than poverty even, Sakina. And I have yet to have a political party that bowls me over with a creative intervention for how we're going to deal with inequality. I think you're right. Keep it simple.
Well, Eusebius, we could go on forever and a day. Time's always the enemy. But thank you so much. Really been refreshing speaking to you after such a long time.
Thank you,
and hopefully this won't be the last time we see you here. It's been a while. Thanks, Eusebius McKaiser. And Eusebius, of course, political analyst and the author of the book, Could I Vote DA? And as you heard there, you'll make up your own mind as to how this goes. Less than a year to the next general election. Well, we're going to cross over now.